When people think about war, they usually imagine tanks, missiles, soldiers, and explosions. They picture battlefields, destroyed cities, and dramatic military operations unfolding on television screens. But there is another side of war that doesn't get nearly as much attention, even though it can be just as destructive. War doesn't only damage buildings and infrastructure. It can quietly tear apart entire economies, draining national wealth, destabilizing currencies, and leaving financial scars that last for generations. The economic effects of war begin almost immediately. As soon as a conflict starts, governments are forced to spend enormous amounts of money. Armies require weapons, ammunition, aircraft, ships, vehicles, communication systems, satellites, and an endless stream of supplies. Military operations require logistics networks, fuel, transportation, intelligence systems, and thousands of workers supporting the war effort behind the scenes. All of this costs staggering amounts of money, far more than most governments keep available in their budgets. Because of this, countries at war often turn to borrowing. Governments issue bonds, raise taxes, and sometimes expand their money supply to pay for military operations. At first, this sudden spending can even appear to boost parts of the economy. Factories may begin running at full capacity producing equipment and vehicles. Employment can rise as workers are hired to support defense industries. On the surface, it can look like economic activity is booming. But beneath that activity, financial pressure is quietly building. Debt levels begin rising rapidly, and the longer the war continues, the more those costs accumulate. Wars rarely end as quickly as leaders expect. What begins as a short military campaign can stretch into years, forcing governments to keep borrowing more and more money just to sustain the conflict. During the First World War, European nations mobilized massive armies and poured enormous resources into the battlefield. At the beginning of the war in 1914, many leaders believed the conflict would end quickly. Instead, it dragged on for 4 devastating years. Governments borrowed huge sums to finance their militaries, pushing national debt to levels that had never been seen before. By the end of the war, entire regions of Europe had been devastated. Infrastructure was destroyed, industries had collapsed, and millions of workers were dead or injured. Rebuilding the economy under those conditions was a massive challenge. Germany faced particularly severe economic consequences. The country had already accumulated massive war debts, and after the war it was required to make heavy reparations payments. In an attempt to deal with these financial pressures, the government began printing more money. The result was one of the most infamous economic disasters in modern history. The German currency collapsed in the early 1920s, triggering extreme hyperinflation. Prices rose so quickly that money lost value almost by the hour. Families who had spent decades saving money suddenly discovered their life savings could barely buy a loaf of bread. People carried stacks of currency just to purchase basic necessities. The economic destruction created widespread anger and instability, showing how the financial consequences of war can linger long after the fighting ends. Even when a nation survives the battlefield, the economic damage can continue shaping its future for years. During the Second World War, governments again mobilized enormous economic resources. Factories that had once produced consumer goods were converted to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Entire industries shifted their focus toward supporting the war effort. In the United States, the war effort led to a massive expansion of industrial production. Government spending surged as the country built ships, aircraft, vehicles, and equipment for Allied forces worldwide. Millions of workers were employed in defense industries, and the American economy grew rapidly during the war years. However, many other countries suffered devastating economic damage. Cities across Europe and Asia were heavily bombed, destroying factories, homes, and transportation networks. Agricultural production was disrupted, trade collapsed, and millions of workers were either killed or displaced. Rebuilding after the war required enormous investment. Entire economies had to be reconstructed from the ground up. Infrastructure needed repair, industries restarted, and financial systems stabilized. Recovery took years, even in the most successful cases. Modern wars still carry these same economic risks, but in today's interconnected world, the effects can spread further and faster. Global markets are tightly linked through trade networks, financial systems, and supply chains. When conflict begins in one region, the consequences ripple across the world almost immediately. Energy markets are particularly sensitive. Oil and gas supplies travel through strategically important regions, and disruptions there can send prices climbing rapidly. Higher energy costs increase transportation expenses, raise production costs, and eventually trickle down to consumers. Investors also react quickly to geopolitical instability. Financial markets dislike uncertainty, and wars create enormous uncertainty. When a conflict breaks out, investors often move money into assets they believe are safer while pulling funds from riskier markets. These sudden shifts can trigger stock market volatility, currency fluctuations, and major movements in global capital. The economic consequences are not limited to countries directly involved in the fighting. Nations around the world can feel effects through higher prices, disrupted trade routes, and shifts in financial markets. This is why modern conflicts are watched closely by economists and analysts. Every escalation has the potential to send shockwaves through global markets. The current tensions involving the United States and Iran are a reminder of how quickly geopolitical events can create economic uncertainty. Only a short time ago, military action between the two countries escalated dramatically, bringing the possibility of a larger regional conflict into focus. Whenever tensions rise in that region, markets immediately react. The Middle East plays a critical role in global energy supply, and any conflict there can influence oil prices and shipping routes. Traders, investors, and governments all watch developments closely because even small disruptions can have large economic effects. Higher energy prices ripple through the economy, affecting transportation, manufacturing, and everyday consumer costs. At the same time, governments involved in a conflict must rapidly increase military spending. Deploying forces, maintaining equipment, and supporting operations across long distances requires enormous financial resources. Even a short conflict can cost billions, while prolonged wars can cost hundreds of billions or more. Over time, those costs accumulate and place additional pressure on government finances. War also disrupts global trade. Shipping routes may become dangerous or restricted, forcing companies to reroute cargo or delay shipments. Insurance costs for transporting goods through conflict zones can rise dramatically. Businesses that depend on reliable supply chains may suddenly face shortages or rising costs. These disruptions spread through the entire economic system. Manufacturers may struggle to obtain raw materials. Retailers may experience shortages of products. Consumers eventually feel the effects through higher prices or limited availability. Even after a war ends, rebuilding economic stability takes time. Infrastructure must be repaired, businesses must reopen, and governments must address the financial burden created by years of military spending. Investors may remain cautious, and economic growth may recover slowly. In many cases, the economic consequences of war can shape political and financial decisions long after the fighting has stopped. Nations may spend years managing debt accumulated during wartime. Currency stability may remain fragile. Governments may need to implement economic reforms to restore confidence and rebuild growth. All of this demonstrates a powerful reality. Military conflict is not just about strategy and battlefield victories. It is also a massive economic event that can reshape financial systems and influence the direction of nations. The longer a war continues, the greater the economic pressure becomes. Resources are diverted away from long-term development and towards sustaining military operations. Infrastructure projects may be delayed, education and healthcare funding may shrink, and economic growth can slow under the weight of wartime spending. Even strong economies can feel the strain if a conflict lasts long enough. Debt accumulation, inflation pressures, and market instability can gradually weaken financial foundations. This is why economists emphasize that wars should be understood not only through military outcomes but also through economic consequences. Victory on the battlefield does not always guarantee financial stability afterward. The true cost of war is measured not only in lives lost but in economic opportunities sacrificed. Years of growth may be lost, national debt may soar, and rebuilding may require decades. In today's interconnected world, these consequences can extend far beyond national borders. A conflict in one region can affect markets, industries, and consumers across the entire globe. Understanding how wars impact economies helps explain why financial markets respond quickly to geopolitical events. Investors, businesses, and governments all recognize that the economic effects of conflict can spread rapidly and unpredictably. While wars may begin for political or strategic reasons, their economic impact becomes part of the story almost immediately. Budgets change, markets react, industries shift, and financial systems adjust to the new reality. History demonstrates the same lesson repeatedly. War begins on the battlefield, but its consequences eventually reach the economy, influencing the financial stability of nations and the lives of ordinary people long after the conflict itself has ended.